Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 311 Griffin YouTube channel. We're going to be talking about low fidelity and high fidelity modules today. And when I say low fidelity, I'm mostly meaning Flaming Cliffs 3, which can be bought as Flaming Cliffs 3 as a package deal or individually. And those are the F-15C, MiG-29, Su-27, Su-33, Su-25, and A-10A. And we're going to be comparing just one or two systems or procedures in the F-15C to the FA-18C Hornet, just to kind of illustrate some of the differences between these modules. Now, I covered some of this in my which module should you buy video, but I've been seeing a lot of questions from new players or people trying to get into DCS about which modules they should get, and there are a lot of different answers out there. Those answers are all probably somewhat valid, but me personally, I think high fidelity modules are the way to go. I think you get more bang for your buck, but I wanted to illustrate the differences so people can have an informed decision to make. Now, before we get into it, if you find my videos helpful or entertaining, which is doubtful, feel free to support the channel, give some thanks, subscribe, like, join the channel, hit up my Patreon, whatever. Or, alternatively, if you've got a charity that you like, that you want to give money to, just give to that and tell me about it, because that's always uplifting and helpful to me. I love seeing people find a need out there in the community and see them give to it. So let me know about it in the comments if you do something like that. I will consider that you supporting this channel. So, like I said, we're going to compare the F-15C to the F-18 just in a couple of simple little procedures so that you can see what exactly is different between low fidelity and high fidelity, and then we'll talk about that a little bit to sort of sum up the differences. So, I prefer high fidelity because I think the learning, while it is a little bit more difficult at first, long term you learn more. And you learn it in a more fulfilling way, and it's transferable. So really quick, to kind of start illustrating the differences, let's look at the controls. And if we pull up the F-15C control list, you'll see a bunch of these numbers, these modes, which are keyboard binds. There's no switches in the aircraft to change these modes, and these modes are greatly simplified. That's one of the biggest issues or things with low fidelity modules. Then, like, if you want to use the cannon, the default button is C. There's no switch in the cockpit. There's no MFD menu thing for that. There's no HUD knob, brightness knob in the cockpit. You have to use keyboard binds for all of this kind of stuff. Now, there is a mod for a clickable cockpit for FC3 aircraft, but I've tried it, and it doesn't do much because there's no systems modeled. Same thing for weapon changes and things like that in low fidelity modules. So if we compare that to the F-18C Hornet, there's a lot more controls here, because basically anything that you can interact with in the cockpit is something that they have bound a control for, or they've made a control for. You don't have to bind most of these, but if you were going to build a 100% home cockpit, a sim pit, you would be able to do all of this, but you can interact with all of this stuff in the cockpit using your mouse, using your HOTAS controls and things like that. So that's a huge difference right there. And now we're going to get into some specific stuff that shows how these wind up in the interface with you. So we're going to start a BVR setup in the F-15C. I'm going to turn my radar on. I'm going to set it to high PRF. I'm going to set it to track while scan mode, and then I am going to put it in the long range mode, which is 2 on the keyboard. We'll talk about these buttons a little bit more. That's going to turn it back into range while search mode, which I forgot about. But I have this bound to my autopilot engage disengage. That turns the radar on for me, and then I use TMS right for the PRF and TMS left for the track while scan. Then I hit 2 on the keyboard to go into the long range mode. Now here I use TMS up for bugging the target, and I realized that put it in single target track because I had gone back to RWS. So I unlocked it with TMS aft, put it back in track while scan mode, and then I bugged both targets. I want to soft lock those in the F-15C. So again, the controls on that, I'm using slew control to slew my radar cursor around, and then TMS up to lock, TMS down to unlock, TMS left to put it back into TWS mode, slew it around some more, and then TMS up again on each target to lock it. This is a little different per aircraft. These are just my buttons that I've set up. So now we've got a Fox 3 that's on this particular module. I use the weapon release button. And since I've got I'm not meaning to go through the procedures for actually how to employ the missiles. This is more about the buttons and the switches that I'm hitting to get to this stage. But because I was in TWS mode and I had soft locks on both of them, I could serve them both a missile each. It doesn't always go this smoothly. In this particular case, I don't think they'd even fired missiles at me yet, which is rare. And so I wound up getting a little bit lucky, and I didn't even have to evade. I die a lot, and you'll find that you'll die a lot in this game. But let's do a similar thing in the FA-18C, doing the BVR setup here. So HMD on with that knob. We're going to go down and set the countermeasures to bypass so that I'm in control of that. We're going to turn it to anti-aircraft mode, set our left MFD to the electronic warfare page so we can see our RWR a little bit easier, and then we're going to start setting up our radar using the right MFD. Now I'm not showing any buttons or switches or HOTAS controls because so far all of this has been done by clicking things in the cockpit. Now you could bind all of these buttons to things that you might have on your desk or around your desk, but I'm using all clickable cockpit. And I'm going to take, while I set this radar up the way I want, this is not academic, this part isn't, but while I set the radar up the way I want to talk about why the clickable cockpit isn't the really big difference. I used to think that, the lack of a clickable cockpit is what makes low fidelity modules not as good. It's the lack of systems that makes it not as good. And the lack of systems is what makes it so that you don't need a clickable cockpit, or that you can't have one actually. So anyway, now I am slewing the radar over on the right MFD, and then I hit the slew depress to get it to look to my right. Because I'm cranking left, I want it to look right. So I'm using slew control on my HOTAS, and then I'm depressing the slew control button to get the radar to look to the right. And now when I have a contact pop up on the radar, I can hit the pinky button on the stick to get it to automatically lock the priority target. This is all just Hornet systems, so the pinky button is behind the paddle switch. You can't really see it there, but that's where it is. That's what I have it bound to. Okay, so now I'm going to turn back in, and we're going to employ missiles. Now on the Hornet, the default is that a trigger press employs systems. It's kind of a true fighter, you might say. It's multi-role, but I ripple fired those because I thought that I had a TWS soft lock on the second target as well, and I don't think I do. I'm also popping countermeasures because there are some missiles inbound. So the trigger to fire the missile, and the CMS forward for flares, CMS aft for chaff is the way I have it bound. So there's not much else to talk about here at the moment, except that so I just put it in bore sight mode, which is sensor control switch forward, and that's default. So I put it in bore sight mode because I didn't have him on my radar screen, and I wanted to point at the aircraft since I could see him. I'm within visual range. I saw him. So I put it in bore sight mode so that it would auto lock. Fired the missile, and you'll see here that I switched to aim 9s. And that's also a key press on my HOTAS, or a button press. So that's the weapon select switch left, which that's the way I have it set up. That's not necessarily default, but switch to aim 9s, get good tone and launch, but he's dead from a previous missile. So a lot going on there. I never touched my keyboard, and there was a lot more systems to manipulate than in the F-15. So we're going to look at an F-16 IR setup real quick. I'm going to turn my HMD on. I'm going to put it in AA mode. There's some missile setup stuff you can do and some radar setup stuff you can do, but I'm not really messing with it here. I'm just going to I use the same slew control for the F-16. I use a different lock procedure for the F-16. The system works a little bit differently, so I use a different lock procedure, and I'm not necessarily going to go into the details on it, but and then I use my slave button. There's a slave button to get my IR missiles to look at my radar contact that I have bugged. I don't have Fox 3s on here. I don't have AMRAAMs, so we're using IR missiles. So now I'm turning back in. I'm waiting on, basically just hoping to be in range. Now, the problem with this kind of a fight is when you're in range, they're in range, and vice versa. So, Fox 2, an incoming missile. I see my hit, and whoo, I just barely missed that guy. Now, there's another plane out there that I'm going to run from, but we're going to talk about the differences here real quick before we wrap up the video. I think that you guys have seen enough. So with Flaming Cliffs 3 low fidelity modules, the cons are that there's lower end systems modeling. That's the biggest negative, and that requires, or basically is the cause of, a non-clickable cockpit, which makes it a little bit harder to learn because you're trying to learn keyboard shortcuts. You're not trying to learn the systems. Okay, there's usually a simpler flight model. The pros are that it is cheaper. The price is a pro for low fidelity modules. Regularly, those are $15 a piece compared to $80, which is a little over 18% the cost of a full fidelity module. And in this particular case, when we're talking about price, full fidelity means a modern fighter jet full fidelity module. The Warbirds are not as expensive. But 15 compared to 80, right now there's the summer sale going on, and it's $750 compared to $55, I believe, which is an actual, that's a little bit of a better deal, because it's more like, I think it's more like 14% the price of the full fidelity modern jets. If you buy it as Flaming Cliffs 3, I think it's normally $50, and right now it's $25, which is a heck of a deal. I bought Flaming Cliffs 3 before there were any full fidelity modern fighter jets. I really wanted to get into the fighter jet thing, and I did learn the basics of radar usage and RWR usage with the F-15C. I've also had a lot of fun flying the Su-27, Su-33, and the MiG-29 around, so it's fun, and there are things you can learn, and there are things you can learn that are transferable. Okay, so in some ways, the low fidelity modules are easy to get into. Now, with full fidelity modules, the cons are kind of the inverse, the pros and the cons. The price is higher. They're harder to fly because there's more things you have to interact with and more things you have to do while you're flying, and there are more systems to learn. That doesn't mean you have to learn them all. I still haven't learned everything with the A-10C, but I can do pretty much everything that I want to do with it. So, that's a high fidelity module. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot to learn, but you don't necessarily have to learn everything to fly a high fidelity module. But there is more to learn. The pros are that the learning is actual procedures as opposed to keyboard shortcuts. There's a better long-term reward. You can generally do more with high-fidelity modules. They have more things that they're capable of doing, and the skills are more transferable. So that is why I personally recommend going with a high-fidelity module that you are interested in as opposed to low-fidelity, and even as opposed to a trainer. A lot of people will recommend getting trainers. I don't, because it's a game, and it is a trainer. If you jump in an F-16 right off the bat as a new pilot, that is a trainer because it's a sim. Now that doesn't mean that you're dumb if you get a trainer, or if you want a trainer, or if you want a low fidelity module. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you or that you're making a bad decision. If that's what you want, then get it. And I'm not going to knock it. This is just my preference for the way I think that you're better off in the long run with DCS. So I hope that that made sense. I hope that it's helpful, especially for newer DCS people who are kind of thinking, man, I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. I don't want to jump into a full fidelity module if it's really that hard. But I think in the end you will be happier, and that doesn't mean that you can't also get Flaming Cliffs 3 aircraft either standalone or as a package and have fun with them. You will. I still fly the F-15 around sometimes. It's just that I don't prefer it because the other aircraft are actually more enjoyable. They're funner. There's more to do. They're more rewarding. It's a really awesome experience. So that's it. That covers it. Thanks for watching, and happy flying.